Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the UDOS podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about things you may not know enough about. So today, myself and Muiz,
Hi everyone.
so myself and Muiz are going to talk about a topic that is very relevant, particularly to us UNITEN students. We're going to be talking about energy, or more specifically, an alternative energy source known as geothermal energy. So this is a source of energy that is very much overlooked and could easily supply more than 50% of current electricity today. So before we move on to anything else, let's start with a little bit of context, right? So geothermal energy is essentially the heat from the Earth's core that reaches the surface. Right? It is an untapped source of very renewable energy that could potentially sustain humanity in the far foreseeable future. Now, to put into perspective, 0.1% of the sum of heat content that we get, geothermal energy that we get, could be enough energy to sustain us for upwards of 2 million years. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems like a very long time for very little tapped power that we can access. That seems insane. So, geothermal energy was something that's discovered quite a while back. It was used very early on in the late 1800s, mainly to heat buildings. And in the early 1900s, it became something that was used for very small scale electricity generation. Small scale even now, because even today, only roughly 29 to 30 countries use geothermal energy very actively. I can't remember this country in particular, but I remember there is one that is almost 90% reliant on geothermal energy. So they have a lot of volcanoes, and near the volcanoes is where they have set up a number of facilities that uses geothermal energy. I can't remember the name of the country. I'll probably put it up as a notifications on the video somewhere. So let's talk now about US's electricity mix in particular, right? There's 19.6% a number of other renewable sources of energy. 60% fossil fuels, which came as a surprise to nobody. Roughly 20% nuclear. And here's the kicker, right? 0.4% geothermal energy. There are only roughly 60 or so geothermal plants in the US, which, considering this untapped potential we mentioned earlier, and considering how far this could take us, is an absurdly small amount, all things considered. So, there has to be an explanation as to why it is not as actively used as something like fossil fuels. So, Moise, would you care to speak of the number of issues that geothermal energy faces today?
Right. So that's a very clear introduction on to what we're going to talk about, right? But there are just a few things I want to add on. I think that when we talk about energy in general and how society views energy right now, there is a very clear understanding that we need to shift away from all of these toxic ideas of pollution and move towards more green energy. And what mainstream media usually covers isn't something that is geothermal. Like, this is mainly because geothermal, like you have said before, it was something that we discovered many years ago. Like, it's not something new. There's no kick to it. Like, politicians don't like to say it. That's why the comparative that usually exists on mainstream media is nuclear energy. There is this whole new branch that is going to modernize everything. But when you compare it to the word geothermal, it isn't as groundbreaking, world breaking. Like, it's not revolutionary. So that's the very first thing, because politicians or policymakers in general just don't like things that don't rally support from the general public. But talking about the name is one thing. Let's talk about the more technical aspects of trying to pioneer a whole new industry, right? So talking about the technical aspect, it is clear to say that money is involved, very much. But the thing about geothermal energy is the assumption that the upfront cost is incredibly high. First and foremost, we don't really have that much R&D behind geothermal energy. The fact that it is always something taken for granted. We always use what nature usually gives us. Amag has somewhat given the example of the country with a lot of volcanoes. So in that instance, it is by natural geographical location that this country was blessed with having geothermal energy. But the thing about geothermal energy is the fact that it is available everywhere. It is just a matter of should you dig further into the ground to find that geothermal energy. So to countries that don't have the resources or don't have the greatest perspective to dig into the ground that much, for example, countries like Canada or countries that are incredibly cold, for example, those countries have a very high upfront cost to look for locations, to build those plants, to now continue drilling holes and like getting that energy in the first place. It already expends a whole lot of energy to try and get this quote unquote energy that is still unsure if it is renewable or if it is sustainable or if it meets the demands of the people in that instance. So the ultimate outcome of all of these issues piled upon each other is the fact that geothermal isn't as seen as something that is so groundbreaking, something that can be accessible to everyone, and it is only accessible to a few blessed communities that is given the proper geographical location by the forefathers and where they decided to set up civilization and all that stuff. Yeah. Right. So I guess we understand how like the issues regarding geothermal exist. But with the new shift in perspective in society, I think it's very important for us to analyze how the development of the industry is right now and how it can be going forward. Maybe Alma can shed some light on this.
Right, thanks, Moise. So a little bit to continue the point of that country. Country is actually Sweden. I completely slipped my mind. So Sweden is the country that's currently pioneering the use of geothermal energy. They have, I think, to date, 30% of their electricity generation is geothermal energy, which comparatively to the 0.4% of the US is a very big gap, right? So if anything, based on this, we can say that there is definitely development being done into geothermal energy. Let's look at status quo, yeah? Like Moise mentioned earlier, oil and gas sector is growing increasingly more unstable because there is an increase of awareness in things like climate change and we want to avoid pollution. We are already seeing effects in the environment of the change in our climate. So people are becoming more and more aware. So with all of this happening, the demand for greener energy continues to go up. Even more so because of the fact that many scientists are now saying that there is a deadline to when our power will run out or where we will damage our planet to the point where it is and we are unable to recover from it, right? So there's a deadline. So the stress is piling up. So there are many companies, large companies that are actually changing energy policies to accommodate for a number of these industrial changes made to what a primary power supply should be like. Take, for example, a company called Chevron and BP. And these two companies particularly invest primarily in geothermal energy. So we know that there is some amount of development actually being put into this. So the question now becomes, how easy is it to transition from something like oil and gas that we have relied upon for years upon years to this, right? So first thing to understand is that the drilling skills are actually very similar. So much like oil and gas and fossil fuel based energy sources, they are found deep underground. So that's one plus over there. So this shows that at the very least, the technical developments required to utilize this energy source is already there. They already exist. We don't have to find some groundbreaking technological advancement to be able to access more of geothermal energy. So there's also shale revolution, where development of hydraulic fracturing and sort of horizontal drilling that has recently come about. I believe, if I'm not wrong, there was an article released on it in about 2016 that actually spoke about it specifically in geothermal energy. This was actually a very interesting read. Essentially, what the concept of it is it's drilling into underneath and sort of horizontally within a volcano to access better heat sources. Now, these drills are said to be a lot faster as well. So this is a very interesting concept as well. So with all of this technology already existing and developments being made, Moise, tell me about how the future in terms of, say, new energy startups are using this technology and how it applies into the energy generation world.
Right. So the development of what's going to happen in the future, right? I like how you brought us into this idea of drilling and how we have horizontal drilling. Like those are aspects that exist even within the oil and gas industry that can similarly be applied to geothermal, right? So like let's start with the very first method of like the whole mechanization of how we want to further develop geothermal energy. And that is with the system known as Enhanced Geothermal System, also known as EGS. So EGS and all of the other name that I'm going to mention in a bit is there are cool names that roll off the tongue that can garner and rally support. Like this is why these new names are important. This allows for these startups to get the attention of more people to support their companies and allows for politicians to like place more importance in geothermal, especially when the alternative that exists is nuclear and it is similarly as vague as geothermal in that instance. So going back to EGS, right? So EGS is the system in which you create reservoirs instead of using pre-existing ones, right? So what does this mean? So Amma has stated before that countries with a lot of volcanoes with already existing geothermal can already use geothermal that comes naturally from porous rocks and heat that comes up from the earth's core, just like that. But with EGS, you can drill into the ground, you can make these porous systems yourself, and in that instance, you can use the heat from the earth and like heat up water that you inject into the ground such that the water can become steam and goes back into the factory to spin turbines, and at that point it's just energy conversion in that instance. But basically it is the fact that you use the heat to generate energy from the ground using water and the change of matter in that instance, right? So a very popular company that is using this EGS is called Fervo Energy. We'll be putting links in the description for those who are interested in further readings. So that's the first one regarding EGS, right, Amar? So the second one is very similar to EGS, and it is called Advanced Geothermal Systems. AGS, right? These names are very similar, but they're cool names to gain public traction, right? So much like EGS, AGS uses these water drilling as well as horizontal drilling to make reservoirs as well. However, the difference is the fact that they use the water in a closed system. That means the water does not change, or the water or any other liquid, that it does not change through matter, but it rather uses conduction to transport the earth's heat from the undersurface, like underneath the surface, towards the surface purely through conduction, and you don't have the change of matter in that instance. It is purely conductive. So, right, the claim benefits, at least from a company that is similar to Fervo, which is Earvol Technologies, is the fact that there is no contamination, that there is less fracking that is required, and there is not as much of a seismic risk. The fact that everything isn't as much of a moving part, but rather it is just the earth having a more conductive medium to transport the heat to the surface. So like that's AGS, right? It is very similar to EGS in which it uses drillings and fracking, that technologies that we already had in the oil and gas industry. But the final aspect of how these factories usually work, or how we're going to generate energy, is a mix of both worlds, because ultimately not every place is the same, not every geographical location has the same advantages or disadvantages that other places have. For example, in more porous areas, it is much more easier for you to just use the EGS, where you create reservoirs and use steam to help generate electricity rather than pure conductive. But in other areas, for example, where you don't have that ability, maybe conduction is the better option. And that is where you have companies like Green Fire Energy, which uses a hybrid of both systems in geographical locations, which it believes is the most advantageous for that location. And the final, which is just like a side branch of all of the others, is called which is largely popularized by the company Sage Geosystems, and in which it integrates all of the methods above. However, the takeaway is the fact that it modifies existing oil and gas locations as well as technologies such that they can decrease the startup cost that is very high, especially in those places, in that areas lah. So in those systems, everything is largely working together such that we can easily transition from the oil and gas industry towards pioneering this geothermal industry, where you already have somewhat of a step into that industry that you don't really have with other renewable energies, which I think Amma will get into later on.
Yeah.
So, like, going back into the development of the industry, right? I think a very large concern that people have is regarding what happens to the workers of the oil and gas industries. What about the blue collar workers? What about the very learned engineers that have spent years studying how to make all of these plants in oceans, for example? And I think the concern is like very legitimate, but it is ultimately something that you can transition away from oil and gas and reuse those skills in the geothermal industry. Fracking technologies can similarly be applied. Drilling infrastructure and tools can similarly be transitioned over. So even if it might seem very negative in the beginning, the forefront or the prediction or the outcome of our industry that we're discussing today sees like somewhat of a profitable outcome in the long term in that instance, right? So I've discussed somewhat about how we can see and how certain methods of getting the energy from the Earth's core is. Maybe Alma can elaborate further on like the benefits of geothermal and maybe comparing it with other alternatives, for example, that media really likes to talk about.
Right. So thanks, Moy. So the thing about a lot of the benefits that we're going to talk about is that to make it a bit easier to understand just how much of an improvement it is, we're going to compare with a number of alternatives that already exist for a number of specific roles, right? So let's start with the first one, being heat production. Now, while it may seem like a small thing, oh, nothing, it's heat production, just keep in mind that a very large majority of countries in the world actually have significant temperature changes as the seasons change. Number one, not like we would know. We are in Malaysia. We don't get it. We get rain. That's all we get, right? But let's say any country that are closer to the poles, Russia, Canada being the two that I can name to mind that have significant temperature changes, utilize any heat production technology very immensely. So now the situation is, let's compare it with something like wind or solar energy, right? Now when we generate this power through whatever means we have, what is produced is electricity, and that electricity is then converted into heat. Now this ties back to a little bit of heat transfer, right? Where when that transfer happens, there's always some amount of energy that's lost to the environment. Now the comparative to wind and solar is that in geothermal energy, that heat is already available. And that at the same time, it still produces electricity. So what it does is that it increases the effectiveness of the energy that we get, increases the cost effectiveness of actually heating buildings, which becomes a very important thing in colder geographies. So like Iceland, for example, while Iceland isn't nearly as cold, Iceland utilizes technology a lot more than any other country that exists. To my knowledge, I believe Russia also does to some extent, but I'm not sure on that. So if there's anything, I'll leave links in the description. So that's about heat production, on how we can make it much more efficient than what exists. Now let's talk about comparative infrastructure and location on where we can actually get resources for this energy. Take, for example, oil and gas for one. We have to find significant oil packets wherever they are and mine to them, sometimes in the middle of the ocean. Right? They're not just, oh, you know what? Underneath my building, for example, there's going to be a huge oil reservoir. It's not going to happen, right? It makes it number one, costly, and number two, difficult to produce a consistent amount of. The same can be said about something like solar and wind. Need specific locations. Solar, you have someone that has unobstructed light of the sun, constantly heat and light of the sun, as much as possible. Wind needs to be a situation where, for example, wind, I believe that there's actual terminology for it that I can't remember, but it is where two wind currents actually meet. So something like that, where there are not much open buildings. I can't remember the terminology, but it's something like that. That is required for wind. Again, Moise, correct me if I'm wrong. But all of these need very specific locations and very, very specific infrastructure to be able to use. Comparatively, geothermal has nothing of the sort. There is heat everywhere. Can be used in urban areas, can be used in small islands. The only difference is that in different places you have to dig a little bit deeper to get access to it, right? It's available at every second of the day, not like solar energy where, for example, at night efficiency is a lot less. The Earth's still going to be hot at night. So the alternatives to solar and wind that requires, say, strong wind or constant daylight, for example, clearly shows that geothermal produces something that is much more efficient. Another thing to consider is that in terms of baseload power, in terms of how much it generates from the foundational level, right? Geothermal is significantly higher than something like solar or wind. Because for one, it doesn't rely nearly as much on batteries or capacitors to deliver some amount of reliability. What I mean by this is, say you have a daylight farm, a solar farm, right? So in many cases, the way solar farms work is that in newer technology has it so that there's one, say, a tower, for example, that has solar panels on it that absorbs the energy. And then in a huge area surrounding it, they have mirrors that concentrate light into that tower. Now that is where the energy is collected and they are stored in capacitors, and then they are distributed in whatever way, whatever company distributes it. So now that entire middle ground of having to store it first and then distribute it is completely eradicated with geothermal energy. Because number one, the energy is so potent and it's always constant. So these are advantages that really geothermal has over any other method of reliable, renewable energy generation. So I think that it's much like Moise said, where at this point it's a matter of how we brand it to be appealing not only to the public but to other large-scale energy generation companies as well. What do you think, Moise?
Right. In that instance, I think it's very important for the large population to understand all of these benefits, but also try to be able to bring up these ideas to discussion such that more and more people have this awareness. But ultimately, the ones that are going to make the most impact are those with a lot of bucks, right? So if, for example, companies like BP or Chevron who can be able to invest as much money into geothermal and see how the industry and testing the waters and see the outcome or the future of the industry is, then I think we'll have more information at that point. Now then, Amma, before we want to finish this, just a few disclaimers, right? It is not to say that alternative energies or every other forms of energy besides geothermal doesn't really have all of the advantages that we stated, right? But of course, there are advantages. Let's talk about the batteries, for example. As much as the batteries are not as much required in geothermal, it is very much beneficial towards that. The fact that you can now store energy in terms of if there's a breakdown of factory, for example, in that instance, the industry that primarily pioneers batteries, for example, like solar or wind, where the baseload power isn't as high, can similarly be transferred into this geothermal energy, and we can all have better batteries in society, right? And no one wants to die, go to communities, and then their phone just dies without battery. So ultimately, this industry with regard to energy is something that is very interesting, and it helps each other and it complements each other. But the fact that geothermal is not given the spotlight that many others are given is somewhat of a misnomer and somewhat unfair towards geothermal energy.
Definitely. I agree with you in that regard. Definitely. I think all of these technologies, considering how new they are, well, except geothermal in this case, could all learn from each other, take bits and pieces of a puzzle almost, right? Right, so that's all from us today. I hope you guys enjoyed our podcast for this session. If you liked the video, you can leave a like down below. If you disliked it, you can click the thumbs up button twice. All of our references will be in the description. Any material that we've used to source this, including a video that we took, will be in the description. If there are any corrections that we'd like to make, they will also be in the description. That's it. Thank you guys for watching and have a good day.